Welcome to the Michael Liebowitz Show. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and I'm continuing with my series on the current status of what might be loosely called the liberty movement. And today's guest is more than qualified to discuss this. He's a candidate for the Democratic nomination for Congress in Virginia's 5th District. He's also the author of Dictator From Day One, How Donald Trump is Overthrowing the Constitution and How to Fight Back. Robert Tracinski, welcome.
Thanks for having me on again.
So, first thing I want to ask a couple maybe preliminary questions.
Sure.
If you were to define freedom, how would you define it?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, I think we have there's two definitions of freedom that are relevant. One that's most relevant for politics is simply the absence of coercion. The state is not telling you what to do, or some non-state actor like a gang or like in the South, you have the Ku Klux Klan and these sort of vigilante groups who would coerce, who would enforce a certain kind of social order through coercion, right? So nobody who's capable of using coercion is forcing you into living a certain way or doing certain things or not doing certain things. That's the fundamental political definition of freedom. But I also think, and this is sort of relevant to our, the role the culture wars have in our current political debate, which is we also use freedom in a somewhat non-strict sense to mean sort of a social freedom, an acceptance or open-mindedness to living, to each person designing their own life the way they want, living the way that they want, having it's the sort of the freedom of lifestyle. Which this is sort of, and actually it's interesting. So historically, my background's philosophy. I have to talk about this. That John Locke is the guy who established English philosopher John Locke from the late 17th century. He's the guy who established, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. They're deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That's Jefferson's language in the Declaration of Independence, but that's all just him summarizing the philosophy of John Locke. So establishing freedom in the sense of freedom from state coercion, especially, that was Locke's accomplishment. But the guy who then talks about liberty or freedom in that social sense is John Stuart Mill, who talked about this idea of having experiments in living, and also talked about the value of having free and open discussion and tolerating all different views, because in having free and open discussion you will be able to engage in the reasoning process necessary to know the truth. So I think those are the two sort of relevant definitions of freedom. But again, one's a political concept of freedom. One is more of a cultural concept. And I think, we have to keep the two separated because, one of the things that happens today, of course, with the conservatives is that in complaining about the cultural, there's too much cultural freedom in their viewpoint. In complaining about that, they then therefore we need the state to come in and correct this problem. So it's important to keep those two realms of state and culture separate.
Okay. Now, how long have you been involved in promoting freedom publicly? I mean, not like in your high school debates and stuff, but publicly doing so.
For over 30 years. Let's see. I started out as a freelancer in 1994, so that gives you some. Oh gosh, that's like 32 years now, I guess.
Yeah. All right. Just so I get your view on freedom, because there's a lot of different ones, even though we use the same language, we often mean very different things. What role or what place in freedom do you think the United States Constitution has?
Well, so here's the interesting thing about the United States Constitution is the United States did not invent the concept of freedom. We got that from John Locke and from a long history going further back. What the United States Constitution did is that up to the basically 1789 or up to the last part of the 18th century, the founding of America, and the founding of America is this long thing that happens. It happens over a period of like 15 to 20 years, because now that we declare independence, then we have to win the war, then we have to have create all these new state constitutions, and then you have to create a federal constitution that actually works, as opposed to the one we tried the first time around. So it's this long process, but basically that long process. And then, of course, you have to hold on to it, right? You have to actually having established that constitution, you have to make it work. So let's say there's this 25-year period starting around 1776. And before that, freedom as a large-scale concept, as the organizing principle for a society, was more speculative. It was an ideal. It was something philosophers had written about, but nobody ever actually, I mean, the British Constitution had gotten the closest there was to enshrining elements of freedom. There was an English Bill of Rights. There was various, going back to the Magna Carta, various legal basis for being able to assert, your freedom. For example, habeas corpus, the thing saying the government can't arrest you without having to go before a judge and justify why it arrested you. That's something that goes back to somewhere in the 1100s to 1200s, depending on which version of it you're looking at. So a lot of these things have been established piecemeal, but nobody had ever really created a society fully based on freedom and on self-government. And it was kind of speculative. It was kind of like an idea the philosophers had that you could do this, but nobody actually made it work. And there have been a lot of small scale failures of this over the years. And so actually putting in an implementation, saying, here's how we're going to make the rules work. We're going to create a workable, effective system that can actually last and survive. That was the achievement of the Constitution. It was taking the sort of theoretical aspect of freedom and putting it to show that, yes, we can actually have this be not just a functioning system, but a thriving and growing and powerful system. And so I think that's the role the Constitution plays, is actually bringing the concrete legal and structural and political reality to the theoretical idea of freedom. Now, so by the way, one other thing, if we're talking about freedom, one other concept of freedom I think is important is the idea of self-government. That you are free if you govern yourselves, if you are not governed by an elite, an oligarchy, an aristocracy, etc. And that's the thing that was, I think, most revolutionary, because in the British system, you had this hybrid of freedom, protections for individual rights, the English Bill of Rights, and all of that. But that was a hybrid of that with a semi-aristocratic and monarchical system. And over the years, that the power of the monarchy and the power of the aristocracy had been sort of whittled away, but you still had this sort of hybrid of the two. And that's what was even more radical about the U.S. Constitution is it was this idea that no, we don't need to have any of that aspect. We don't need to have any of that traditional English. That we're going to keep all the good parts of the traditional English system of law and system of government, but then we're going to get rid of the role of the aristocracy, get rid of the role of the monarchy, and we can still make it work. Okay,
so as someone involved in promoting liberty, you obviously are familiar with the concept of schisms and different views on liberty. So when I look at it, there's a few different ways we can divide this. We can go between objectivists on one hand and libertarians on the other. But then within libertarians, we have anarcho-capitalists and minarchists, plus we have the moral arguments and the sort of economic utilitarian arguments. And then when we come to objectivism, not the broader philosophy, but just the political sort of implementation or political views surrounding people who advocate the philosophy. We have people that support Trump, that don't support Trump, and there's a lot of arguments over that. Is this fragmentation? Jim Valiant, my friend, has told me that fragmentation is actually a good thing if you look historically at different movements. And he cited Christianity. He said if you look at early Christianity, there's all these different camps, different views. What is your view of the fragmentation? Fragmentation and schism aren't the same thing, but I'm going to lump them together because it helps with the communication. What's your view on this?
Oh, okay, so one thing I would say is this is absolutely standard for every political or intellectual movement, right? There is no there's no ideal state of non-fragmentation. Let's put it that way. I mean, like, if you follow, I don't know how much you followed of this business with Graham Plattner up in Maine, this sort of Hindenburg-like collapse of his candidacy. But there's a lot of people who are cheesed off about it because he was the hope for the sort of the progressive faction, the sort of Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders faction against the the compromising, weak-kneed liberal mainstream in the Democratic Party. So, every movement, every party has this fragmentation between them. And it's natural for a couple of reasons. One is there's always going to be disagreements over what is the exact meaning of this ideal, what is the exact best way to. There's differences over tactics, even. Like, do we stick by a guy named Graham Plattner? Despite all the scandals, do we say, oh, that's just being thrown up by his enemies? Do we stick by him, or do we, decide that no, we need a sort of non-corrupt or we need a better standard bearer for our ideas? So there's even when you don't have ideological differences, there's always difference in tactics that divide people. So this is all very standard. And so I think the real key to this, to divisions, is not, do you have these divisions? It's how do you deal with them? And I think a healthy movement in general has the ability to, to accommodate different disagreements, ideological disagreements, in a way that allows people to actually, debate and discuss them, as opposed to trying to, I think you talk about the difference between fragmentation and schism. And I think that the difference is schism comes from, oftentimes come from some one person trying to impose a dogma and say everybody has to be in perfect agreement on this, and therefore if you're not in perfect agreement, we're going to divide off from you. And I think that there are times when you have to do that. There are times you have to say, okay, this view over here is so outrageous, so far so far beyond the pale that we're not going to cooperate with those people. You're not part of our movement. You're a different movement. But at the same time, you also have to generally have the ability to accommodate disagreements within a movement. And like right now, I'm very focused on the idea of building a united front. So one thing to back up on here is I don't know if you followed what happened to this election that happened this summer, earlier this year in Hungary. But Hungary is a place where this guy named Viktor Orban, who's the sort of the strongman, the ruling strongman there, basically did everything Donald Trump's trying to do in terms of concentrating executive power, entrenching his party, changing the rules, election rules, so that his party could, with a very small majority, have a dominant supermajority in the legislature and change the Constitution, and basically trying to entrench their rule forever. And he managed to do it way beyond what Donald Trump's been able to do. Managed to do it and stay in power for 16 years. He was just defeated in an election, and they're now Hungary's in the process of they're just doing a thing where they're like closed down their state broadcasting company to try, basically because it was engaging in propaganda, and we're going to shut this thing down so we don't have this propaganda operation going on with government funding. So that's a case, though, where how they defeated Orban is they had this broad united front, including a lot of different factions that hate each other and are probably going to be fighting each other again. In a year or so, they'll be going hammer and tongs at each other because they have big disagreements. But they realized the only way they could defeat Viktor Orban was if they all worked together and formed this broad united front. And I think that's the situation we're in right now. Now, I don't know if you want to talk about the Trump versus anti-Trump thing among the objectivists, because it's the one that's kind of, in a way, puzzling to me, but also very, very interesting. But I think part of that comes from the fact that a lot of these, and I think this is something that goes beyond the objectivists too, a lot of these liberty movements were formed in the 20th century when the big global conflict the big ideological conflict was capitalism versus socialism. And I think the problem is that we've changed, that the world has changed since then. And the big dividing line right now is liberal democracy versus authoritarianism. And I think that a lot of people aren't making that adjustment terribly well because
I do want to get into that, actually. Yeah. Because, and I'm going to tell you my view, and I'll get you. There's this view, and, I'll name names. I don't really, my friend Andy Bernstein
Mm-hmm.
is perhaps the most outspoken. That the
Mm-hmm.
left is just so bad and so evil with the wokeism and all that, that they have to be combated, and that justifies supporting somebody like Donald Trump. My personal view is that I agree that these people are bad and they're reprehensible, but the way to defeat them is with philosophical consistency and logic. And I think that the threat coming from the right is just as bad, if not worse. For one thing, we have the post liberals, Patrick Deneen's, and JD Vance seems to be in that camp. Plus, you have sort of the Tucker Carlson, Candace Owen, whack stuff. But even in the person of Donald Trump, first of all, Barack Obama is not president right now, right? Donald Trump is. Also, beyond just the pure danger of what Donald Trump will do, I've never in my lifetime seen a politician with the devotion that he gets, with the sort of cult following that comes along with him. Prior to him, I would have said that Barack Obama was the biggest. But even that, in my view, doesn't match what we have with Trump. And I think to focus all ire on what is just bad thinking and bad policies on the left inside with Trump, I think is a big decision. I mean, a bad decision. It's big too, but bad.
Yeah.
So my question to you was actually going to be, and I think I know the answer, but I would just want to give you a chance to say it. What is the bigger threat to the long-term freedom movement and our actual liberties? Does it come from people on the left, or does it come from, I don't even like to call it the right, but I don't have a better term for it right now. So I'll just go with what most people consider to be the right.
Right. Well, I don't want to talk about long term. I think the right is the bigger short term threat.
Okay.
Absolutely, because Donald Trump actually has power right now. And you mentioned that I wrote a book, Dictator From Day One, and it's really about how Donald Trump is taking active steps to concentrate all decision-making power on one person. I mean, down to tiny things like, what should the Cracker Barrel logo look like, right? He wants to be in a position of, I get to decide all of these things. And by the way, I have a whole chapter about the fact that he's not a defender of the free market in any way. He's actually a defender of a controlled market, a market where everybody answers to him. Right. So he's not a free marketer. He is, and this goes to what I was talking about, how, in the 20th century, the big division was capitalism versus socialism. And I see Donald Trump as almost like a reversion to something that's before, he's not a socialist. He's anti-capitalist, but he's not a socialist. He's in favor of the system that came before capitalism. He's got a sort of neo-feudalist outlook in which, the strong man is the guy who everything has to go through. If you want to do anything, if you want to run a business, you have to get permission from the local strongman and give him a cut of the take. And it's this sort of like feudalist system of economics that almost he wants to go back to, or a feudalist or aristocratic system of economics he wants to go back to. But we're talking about long-term versus short-term. I think the long-term danger to liberty in this country is the fact that you have a lot of false alternatives that were offered. And I think the sort of far left versus far right. I mean, go back to the 20th century. That one thing that still persists to some extent. I say, we've gone beyond the 20th century. The ideological and geopolitical differences are not the same, but there's one thing that is the same, which is if you go back to the 1930s, it was fascism versus communism. Right. And those were the big alternatives. Well, from historical perspective, we can see those weren't alternatives. Those were two variations on the same thing. There were two variations on a strong man is going to come in and use force and abuse state power in order to impose on you his view of the way you ought to live and how things ought to be. So I think the biggest long-term danger is people having that thing in their head that it's one of those or the other, and not actually having a concept of what a free society looks like. So I think that we have to, I've always long held the idea that, we have to get rid of the left versus right political spectrum and instead have a political spectrum that is, I'm actually going to steal this from, I know I'm running as a Democrat now, but I'm going to steal this from Ronald Reagan, which he said it's just the time for choosing speech he gave in 1964. He has a really good line where he says, there isn't the left or right, there's just up or down. Up to the maximum amount of freedom and down to totalitarianism. And so I like the idea of the up-down, because when you're going down, it doesn't really matter that much if you're going down into the left or down into the right. And if you're going up, it doesn't really matter as much whether you're going up from a more left-leaning perspective or up from a more right-leaning perspective, whether you're emphasizing, the freedom of markets or the freedom of the social freedom, the ability to make your own choices about your own life, your own personal life. As long as you're moving upward, that's the good thing. So I think we need to sort of readjust our whole outlook to be that sort of up to the maximum amount of freedom versus down to totalitarianism as the fundamental alternative.
In the specific case of Trump, and this will be the last, well, maybe the last question I ask about him, but so you're in objectivism, which obviously you know, but maybe the audience doesn't. We have concepts, right? A big focus is on concepts in the epistemology, and I don't want to get too far into that, but epistemology is about forming concepts, abstractions, and abstractions has to do with focusing on similarities and doing away with measurements, differences, and that's very important in thinking. With Donald Trump, however, a lot of people, I think, what they do is they collapse distinctions too much. And what I mean by that is if I say this guy is just an absurd liar, all politicians are liars, which is true. But if you collapse the differences and just say, one guy's a liar, I mean, a little kid lies, all little kids tell lies, so do all sociopaths. The degree to which they differ, though, is extreme. Similarly, Donald Trump engages in a lot of shady activity. Well, they all do. But to me, and everybody probably in life has broken the law if you've ever ran a stop sign or a traffic light or sped. But there's a big difference between that and a murderer. Yes, they're both breaking the law, but the distinctions are important. And I think the differences between Donald Trump and virtually every politician that's come before him, at least in my lifetime, is vastly different. You can always say, well, they all do that, but you're obliterating distinctions that matter. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so one of the things that got me into actually running for office, and by the way, I got to plug my site here. So go to TSKI for Congress, TSKI4Congress.com. That has my site. You could donate to the campaign, which I'm discovering, running for office, discovering to what extent the campaign moves on money. But the thing is that one of the things that got me into doing this, to running for office, which I've never done before or wanted to do before, was the fact that I spent most of 2025 running something called an executive watch. This is for a publication called The Unpopulist. They brought me on to do an executive watch, which is cataloging abuses of executive power. And this is something that comes naturally to me. I've done this before. I've complained about abuses of executive power in previous presidencies because every president tries at some point or another to push the envelope, push the outside barriers of executive power. Usually they get frustrated at some point that there's something they can't do, they can't get passed in Congress. So they decide, well, maybe I can do this by executive order. And the courts usually come back and the answer is usually, no, you can't do that by executive order. But so this usually, and I've covered this before, I've criticized presidents for this before, but it's usually something happens like maybe 2 times a year. And when I was doing the executive watch, and they're still going on, by the way, they're still doing it. I haven't been able to do it because I'm running. But it's like I call it 5 impeachable offenses a week. There's 5 things that are outrageously egregious abuses of executive power, and it's happening constantly. And it's happening constantly because that is the actual philosophy he's bringing to it. That I don't think Trump doesn't have philosophical convictions. He doesn't think that way, but he has a conviction. I should have all power. I should be making all the decisions. Everybody should be constantly paying attention to me and following my orders. That's his psychology. And then he's surrounded by a bunch of people who are basically built up a theory of autocratic executive power, who have this viewpoint. Yes, the executive ought to be able to dictate everything. It should be able to dictate what money gets spent, what agencies exist, whether we're at war or not. All these things, and all these things that are very explicitly in the Constitution, not vested in the executive. Like tariffs. Tariffs are clearly in the Constitution, vested in Congress. So is declaring war. So is deciding what agencies exist, deciding what funding exists. That all that stuff is supposed to go to Congress. It's supposed to go through Congress, and Donald. But they have this theory that says, no, we want to have all executive power concentrated there. Now, here's where I want to get to the conceptual part that you're talking about, the conceptual thinking, because that's something. One of the curious things about running for office, if you're somebody who's written about politics, is that if you make a living writing about politics and you run for office, the first thing you have to do is stop making a living writing about politics, because the campaign finance laws, it gets too complicated. Like, if somebody's subscribing to my newsletter, does that count as a campaign contribution? So in my newsletter, I still run my newsletter, Tracinski Letter. I still run that, but I have to do like things that are not too political, too connected to electoral politics. So I could do, here's news items. I can do, and I've been doing a lot of stuff that's more political philosophy. And so one of the things I've been doing is I've been going over doing a series of articles talking about a book called The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. It's a very famous book by a historian named Bernard Bailyn wrote it back in like 1967. And it's a very famous book sort of exploring the pamphlets that were published in the years leading up to the American Revolution. There was this tremendous debate, public debate, that took place often in the form of these cheaply printed pamphlets that could be distributed. And he cataloged all of those and then read through them all and drew out the main themes. And that's what he's writing about when he talks about the ideological origins of the American Revolution. And he makes a point in there about how they were dealing with these specific crises, the Stamp Act and the Boston Tea Party and all this sort of thing, all these different things that Parliament was doing that was causing outrage in the colonies. They were dealing with these specific crises, but they kept using that as an opportunity to go out and look at the broader principles and draw these broader conclusions. He calls it the conceptualization of American life. And that's the thing that I've been harping on for a long time, is the way we need to think like the founders, that they didn't react sort of ad hoc to, oh, here's an outrageous thing here, here's an outrageous thing there, here's something I don't like. They thought in terms of the structure of government and the purpose of government. And they thought in terms of the big ideas and the big picture. And that's something I think is really missing from today's politics. And it's one of the reasons that got me into running, is saying, look, if you're reacting to things sort of piecemeal and ad hoc, and if you go in on the Democratic side, if you have somebody who's going in because, well, they cut this healthcare funding, I want to restore the healthcare funding, you're not really you're not dealing with the fundamental problem that's actually happening, which is the damage being done to our system of government. But that's also the pitch that I've been making to people on the right. And it's something I'm looking forward to do if I win my primary. Our primary is August 4th here in the 5th District. If I win the primary and go into the general election, the big thing I'm going to be saying to a lot of, I'm a former Tea Party guy, right? So I'm going to go back to some of those people, the people who are currently supporting Trump, and saying, look, the problem you have to deal with is you've built Frankenstein's monster. That is because you hate the left so much and you want to suppress the left. And because Donald Trump also hates the left and wants to suppress the left. You've been giving him all of this huge amount of unchecked executive power, and that's Frankenstein's monster. That's the thing that's going to come back to destroy you. And you have to think ahead a couple of years to what happens when all this immense power that you've been giving to Donald Trump, because you like him and you think he's on your side. What happens when that immense power is suddenly being wielded by President Gavin Newsom, or President Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or insert your favorite bogeyman here as the worst person you could think of to be endowed with this tremendous power. And that's what I mean by thinking like the founders, because the founders, they wrote all sorts of limitations on the executive into the Constitution. But remember, when they're writing the Constitution, they're, as the president of the Constitutional Convention, the guy sitting right up there was George Washington, and everybody knew, if we have a president, this is the guy. Everybody knew it's going to be George Washington. Everybody loves him. Everybody trusts him. they weren't writing this stuff because they were afraid of George Washington, right? They knew who George Washington was. They knew he was a man of impeccable integrity. That's why he was there. They weren't afraid of George Washington. They were afraid of the guy who came after him, or the guy who came after him, or the guy who came after him. They were afraid of what would happen sometime in the future when you got somebody who wasn't as good a person as George Washington. And so that's more the thinking we have to have now, that thinking in terms of ideas and principles and projecting future consequences, and understanding that it's not just about, oh, there's transgender athletes over here, which is this, in the scheme of things, it's actually this really tiny little issue. It's like a half dozen of them across, it's a very small, minor issue. But there's transgender athletes over here. That's very outrageous and horrible. We need to stop that. Not be distracted by those small issues and think more in terms of the big issues of, well, what is the whole structure of government? What are the powers that we're giving to the government? What are the limits that we have to have on those powers? And think ahead to the future consequences of that.
So I'm going to trace the origins of the liberty movement, and I know it's somewhat arbitrary, but there's no other way to do it. But there's a good place to start, I think. 1943, 3 books come out. The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, God of the Machine by Isabel Patterson, Discovery of Freedom by Rose Wilder Lane, collectively known as the 3 theories of libertarianism.
Freedom theories, I think somebody called them once.
Yeah, so starting then, or rather comparing then to now, are we in a better spot as liberty lovers than they were then? In other words, have we made progress? Are we going backwards? Is it a mixed bag?
That is a very interesting question. I think we've made progress in the sense that we have what they created, which is, I'm talking about how the biggest problem is people having this sort of left-right continuum in their heads, where the two fundamental alternatives are both basically variations of oppression. Right? And this is, you can see this, like the most extreme form of this was things like the Spanish Civil War, or the things going on in Europe, especially in the 1930s, where you had the Spanish Civil War, you had the street fighting in the Weimar Republic between the communists and the fascists. And this great alternative we had to choose from is, do we want communists or do we want fascists? And one of George Orwell's great insights that I think he got from being involved in the Spanish Civil War was that there's really no difference between them, right? So this is one of the things he puts into his work, is this idea that this equivalence of that all forms of totalitarianism are equivalent. It's just the window dressing that changes. It's just the rhetoric and the style that changes. And I think that's something that goes in 1984, where you have these wars going on between these giant mega powers that are supposedly deadly enemies, but are actually exactly the same, have exactly the same system of government, just with different rhetoric. And that was him talking, basically projecting a future where you have a communism where you have these giant. Where it was writing 1984, right after World War II. We had this giant global battle, and it's the Nazis on one side and the communists on the other, at least on the one front there. So I think, and that was just it's hard to sort of recapture the extent to which that really was the mindset, that those are the alternatives. So you still find people thinking in those terms. So one of the things that the liberty movement, I think, has at its advantage is that you now have this idea that, no, these are not the alternatives. These are actually identical to each other, and that we have an alternative that's fundamentally different from both of those, of having a free society. And I don't think it's just the liberty movement that managed to do that. I mean, I know there are sort of more mainstream, quote unquote, liberals of the old fashioned variety who still have who have a more pro freedom outlook. But the fact that we have that much more clearly defined, I think, is helpful. And the fact also that we had a deeper philosophical debate over what are the principles behind a free society. I think that is, a sort of a revival of pro liberty philosophy, I think, is the most important thing that's happened.
Last question. If you're the boss of the liberty movement. They make you're the guy, and you're going to give out the instructions how everyone is to go out and communicate. What do you think is the best method or the best means of communicating ideas on liberty to people that are not familiar with the arguments of Ayn Rand, Ludwig von Mises, Frederick Bastiat, or John Locke?
Oh, that's a really good question. So right now, I'm so focused right now on I'm not trying to become head of the Liberty Movement. I'm just trying to get the Democratic nomination in one district in Congress. What I will say is that the biggest thing that I've known this as a writer for years. One of the things that you deal with when you're a professional writer and you're out there doing these debates is that you always have to come up against the fact that the average person actually knows a lot less about what's going on in politics than you do. Then there tends to be, and it is something happens with experts in every field. There's something I used to, when I teach writing, there's a little one frame cartoon I use where it's like somebody saying, two geologists talking, and one of them says, the average person doesn't know very much actually about geology. And he says, yeah, he probably only knows the difference in the chemical formulas of quartz and feldspar. And it's like something that's way more advanced, so that the average person knows less than you do. If you're an expert in a field, the average person knows less than you do, even when you're taking that into account. They know less than you think they do. So one of the things we have to do is I'm a big fan of. So I mentioned Bernard Bailyn doing this sort of pamphleteering, going over these pamphlets. Is that those are actually also kind of a model of how to communicate ideas and how to work through ideas, that pamphleteering kind of style, because you have to start with things that are actually happening out in the world, with the crises, with the problems that are actually affecting people. So let me give you an example from something I've been campaigning on. So I'm trying to make this point about getting the people think about the constitutional system and the power that the president has, and focus on that as opposed to focusing on this bad thing happened here, this bad thing happened there. So one thing I've been this Iran war that Trump has been fighting off and again and on again. I think he's on again now. One of the things about this that has been kind of a gift to me in terms of being able to explain this is I'm able to say, but look, you just filled up your gas tank and it cost this enormous amount of money because gas prices spiked. Why did gas prices spike? Well, because we went into this war. And why did we go into this war? Well, it's because Donald Trump just decided one day we were going to be at war, never consulted Congress. So here's a case in which somebody ignoring the constitutional provisions that gives Congress the power to declare war, that has an immediate effect that people notice and that they're bearing the costs of it. That we go into this, basically this war with no strategy, no goal, no endpoint that's going to be going on forever. We go into this because he never went to Congress, and Congress would have had to ask questions. Congress would have said, well, why are we doing this now? What is your strategy? Do you have one? And what if they close the Strait of Hormuz? What if things go wrong? They would have had to ask all these questions. And I think it's become clear that Donald Trump didn't have answers to any of those questions. And if he had gone to Congress, they probably would have said, what, we're going to pass on this idea because we think, you don't have good answers to how this is going to work out. And that would have prevented all these things, the costs that we're bearing from it would have prevented that from happening. So I think you have to sort of start with, here are things that are actually happening. Here are things that you can see, things that are affecting people, and then work people back to, in this case, it's not super complicated, to work people back to, here are the causes. And the cause is that the system is out of whack and there's something fundamentally wrong with the system. Here are the basic ideas and the basic procedures that we're not following that have led to this problem. So I think that's the way you have to do it. You have to engage with the current controversies of the day. And I think one mistake that the Liberty Movement has made a long time is oftentimes they get in. You talked about schisms and fragmentation, is they often get too much involved in debates between each other, and these interior debates in the movement where if a normal person came in, and I'd have to spend half an hour just explaining the context to him for him to understand what we're fighting about, right?
Yeah.
So
I've been guilty of it myself. Yeah.
Yeah, we spend a little too much time on the intramural debates instead of going out there and finding out what are the actual controversies of the day, what are the things that are affecting people that we can be addressing, and then work back from there to show them here's how this comes from the failure to understand some or understand or adhere to some basic principle.
Yeah, I got dragged into a debate the other day. Well, actually, it was a days-long debate about jury nullification. And the interesting thing was, I'm not a proponent, and neither was the guy I was arguing with. We were, but we were arguing about the history, what it is, what can be done. And then it just occurred to me, like, nobody outside this group cares about this at all. I could go to diner after diner, right? I could go to diners, bars, whatever, and I could bring this topic up and there's going to be no controversy because nobody cares. Yeah. And I'm just like, after a while, I said, why am I doing this? I'm spending my time arguing about this. So you make a very, very valid point.
I do want to say, I think there's a point to some of those things because, again, there's a point to having academics out there, debating the finer points of things, because there are sometimes big issues will hinge on seemingly small technical and abstruse things that need to be understood. But on the other hand, I think you have to have the perspective of knowing when that's the case, when this is a case of something that, okay, this is a great thing. I call it Libertarian Debate Club. This is a great thing to have at Libertarian Debate Club. Like, could we actually fund a society without any coercive taxation? Well, great thing for Libertarian Debate Club. Come up with some ideas, and maybe someday this will be a relevant political issue after we've solved, much, much larger problems. But it's important just to keep that perspective in that context of here is something that is a theoretical, a technical theoretical debate that we can have that's worthwhile having, but on the other hand, what's actually relevant to what's going on in politics and in the cultural debate in the country right now.
Yeah, I go, if I go into my local coffee shop and I want to convince somebody of the virtues of a free market, it's not wise for me to start with, listen, if you're going to support capitalism, you need to understand the role of axiomatic concepts and getting, right. I mean, that's not the way to go. Robert, thank you so much. I know you're busy. Thank you so much for being with me this morning, for being with us. Now, where can people find you? Where can they donate? Give them all the information.
Well, right now I'm sending people mostly just to my campaign website. It's T-Ski for Congress. I do a T-Ski because people don't have to spell my name that way. So because of the T ends with a ski, don't worry about what's in between. So T-Ski for Congress, TSKI for Congress.com. Go there. And of course, I've always got the Tracinski Letter, which is my newsletter. And I'm putting out a lot of videos and things addressing. I've got an amusing one I put up yesterday where I'm addressing the disturbing lack of scandals in my campaign, which apparently makes me less interesting to the press and, not enough rough edges to show I'm a true man of the people, I guess. In light of some of the things that have happened up in Maine recently. So, but I'm putting out a lot of stuff there and check it all out. And I definitely, I'm right at the point where I'm doing a lot of fundraising to get me to that last stage of the campaign where I've got a good message. People are responding to the message. It's just getting that message out through as many different channels as I can.
Awesome. Thank you so much again. And thank you, audience. For now, I'm Michael Liebowitz. Until next time.